It's time for an upgrade. All the DK2 footage you've seen so far on this channel was running on this PC, an i7-870 from 2009, 8GB of RAM and an Nvidia GTX 670. The 670 is still a solid card, particularly if you're running games on a single monitor at 1080p, but for VR I was looking for a lot more performance, so I recently upgraded to this GTX 980. As you can see, this is about as small a case as you'd want for fitting high performance hardware inside, so it's not going to win any overclocking contests due to the limited airflow. I managed to get the old i7 up to about 3.5 GHz, but it was already running fairly hot and I wasn't seeing any massive gains. I decided that it was time to pair the 980 with a more appropriate CPU, an i7-4790K. So that's the old motherboard, a P55 chipset from DFI, and this is the new one, a Z97 chipset from Gigabyte. Mini ITX boards are very tightly packaged, so it's even more important to study the layout and install what you can, like the CPU and the RAM, before screwing it into the case. But it's always going to be fiddly when you have to deal with the front panel connectors and other cables. This model has some kind of heatsink over the MOSFETs, so it might help with stability if I start playing around with overclocking, but that's for another video. I'll spare you the agony of watching me trying to refit the CPU cooler, but I used Arctic Silver 5 thermal paste, so hopefully easier to remove next time. Bit of a squeeze to get the 980 back in there too, but there's actually room for an even longer card. It's good to use a blower style GPU cooler for this kind of case, as you want all the hot air blown out the back rather than recirculated inside. A quick look round the other side. There's the Scythe Big Shuriken heatsink. A good amount of clearance between the top 180mm fan and the CPU fan. There's the 8GB of RAM that I was able to reuse, a 600W power supply, SSD there, hard drive above that, and an optical drive on top. It's pretty awkward to put together, but an efficient use of space. There's room for a couple more SSDs, and if I remove the optical drive, I could use the whole top section for a water cooling radiator if I really wanted to push the CPU. This footage was recorded before the upgrade, a test session at Donington. I'm running at 2560 by 1600 with everything pretty much at max, and being one of iRacing's most recent tracks, it seems to be one of the toughest on frame rate. Bear in mind this is exactly the same PC with 8GB of RAM and the GTX 980, but using the old motherboard and the old i7 CPU. Coming down the hill through the Craner curves, it drops from about 190 down to 130 or 140 FPS. Then climbs to about 150 for a while. And then it drops significantly around the back here for some reason. It briefly hit 85 there, and then straight back up to 200. Then it maxes out just about here at 219. Then all the way down this back straight, staying just above 100. And then you'll see a little boost as we change direction at the chicane, and then down to about 100 again. Final corner into the 90s. And then the final straight past the pits. And it reaches its lowest value of 80 just about here. So now compared to the new motherboard and CPU, going through this downhill section, we're well into the 200s. this is where it started dropping. It reached 85 on the old CPU. Here it drops to no less than 151. And this is where it maxed out before at about 219. Here it briefly reaches over 250. And then onto the back straight where we were getting just above 100. Now it's comfortably above 180. And onto the final straight where I was getting below 90. Here it's 150, 160. And the biggest drop was to about 80 before. Here it's about 145. That was 2 separate test sessions, so here's a more accurate comparison where I'm running the same replay on both setups so that the cars are always exactly in the same place. Here's one of my races at Spar, a big grid and always tough on frame rates. The graphics settings are identical, right down to the field of view, the seating position and the mirror angles. It was also running on the same build of iRacing and using the same graphics drivers. The only difference is a new motherboard and CPU. Pretty self-explanatory, so I'll let this run for a while and you should clearly see the huge jump in performance, sometimes double the frame rate. And most importantly for VR purposes, the minimum frame rate is much more reasonable, and considering this is running at 2560 by 1600 at almost max settings and staying mostly above 90 FPS, there is a good chance that this is not only good enough for the DK2, but for the consumer Rift as well. One point about the mirror angles. During these tests I realised how much of a performance impact the mirrors have, not only just enabling them but changing the angles too. Here I'm changing the right mirror from where I was using it for VR back to the default value, and the frame rate goes from about 165 to 190 just from changing the angle through 5.5 degrees. And then the same with the left mirror. Clicking back to the default, it goes from 190 to about 220. So that's a jump of 55 frames per second just from changing the angle of the mirrors. So if you're looking for a bit more frame rate in VR, maybe don't face your mirrors all the way behind you. Here's a quick test of Assetto Corsa, a race at Spar from the back of the grid with 23 AI drivers ahead of me, and again this is using the GTX 980 but on the old i7 870 CPU. So on the grid the frame rate is about 55 FPS, and then as the lights go out it drops pretty severely to about 30, and then quickly climbs back up to about 55. This drop was caused by the smoke effects and everyone doing a slight burnout off the line. If I turn smoke off completely I don't get that drop at all. I'll leave this running for a few corners. You'll see that the frame rate briefly drops to about 45 and sometimes reaches into the 80s, but it's basically averaging around 60. Here's the same settings using the new motherboard and new CPU. It starts off higher at about 85 on the grid instead of 55, but then also drops to about 30 as all the cars generate smoke off the line, so that is definitely killing the GPU and the new CPU isn't helping. Then it tends to average a bit higher, hitting 90 at times, but it's not a dramatic improvement like I saw in iRacing, and it seems far more variable, and it still drops below 50 regularly, and sometimes it looks like the performance is worse. But this was taken from the release candidate build, and Kunos are continuing to optimise their engine, but I think it's fair to say that Assetto Corsa is much harder on the GPU than the CPU compared to iRacing, and I'm not seeing a dramatic improvement with this CPU upgrade. I saw a much bigger improvement when I changed from the GTX 670 to the GTX 980. So it really depends on the sim. iRacing is clearly more CPU bound, and I've seen a huge improvement with this upgrade, but for more modern graphics engines, you're more likely to see benefits from simply buying a new graphics card.